Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you, all of you, for being here. And we have a few friends here. I think Dr. Kwame is here. He's one of the senior faculty here at Lincoln University. My friend and Dr. Fu, who is a professor for political science in the Political Science Department at Lincoln University, and some other friends, Dr. Msia, all the way from Ghana, Adrian Wallace from New York, and Smiling. And then we're going to have a nice conversation today. And then all of you from different parts of the world who are joining us, I am grateful to you all. And then we're going to have a conversation about a very interesting topic. For those who were not here last time, on August the 7th, we launched the first conference. We did the first conference of a new platform that we put together called the New Dawn Vision. We want to put emphasis on the existence of the BRICS and how that new platform or that new institution is shaping international politics and international development. And it is a major shift in international politics. And as we are freedom fighters and justice lovers, and then we are scholars, and then we believe that we needed to engage a conversation on this topic, we have decided to put together that platform. So before that, in 2007, we launched the Revival of Pan-Africanist Forum, which was a platform around which we organized a number of Pan-African conferences in the DC area and in other parts of the world. And then when our friend, Dr. Msia, who is a member of the All-African Revolution People Party, and who also was a member of the Revival of Pan-Africanist Forum when she went to Ghana. He ran her, or she was a member of a number of committees, and they organized several conferences in Ghana, 2017. That was the second Kwame Nkrumah International Festival. And then in 2018, she was the number one organizer of the conference, the 60th anniversary of the All-African people of the All-African Revolutionary, no, the All-African People Conference that Nkrumah organized in 1958. So we've been doing that, and now we think that it is time for us to engage that conversation, to take that to the next level. So that's why we're here. So thanks for being here. Today, we're going to have two speakers. We have Msia Clark, and then we have Sean Blackman. Last time it was Heather Bino, and then Paseka. Paseka is finishing his PhD in South Africa, and Heather is a great activist, member of Party for Socialism and Liberation, and then she's also member of ENSO Coalition, and she's a lawyer. And then she was here with Paseka, and they gave a wonderful presentation on the topic about the BRICS. Today, we want to talk about the shared histories or the shared histories of the BRICS members. So we will talk about that from politics to development. And then I want us to start the conversation now, and then Msia Clark, if you are ready, then I would like you to start so that we can start the day with your presentation.
Thank you. I am in preparing for today, kind of did some research, because the last time I really looked at the BRICS, was probably a few years after it was, people were talking about it, and it was established specifically when South Africa entered. And since then, it kind of like moved away from politics, foreign policy, and those things. So, and coming back, I really wasn't very surprised to find out that the BRICS had not, the establishment of the BRICS did not result in some kind of revolutionary shift in economics and foreign policy, and did not really challenge the hegemony of Western countries in the world. I kind of, remember hearing about it and was like, oh, well, that could be. And it was really established as a challenge to, or saying it was a challenge to, the Western dominance economically, and and like just really saying that they were going to do something different, and that they were going to challenge the status quo. And for China and Russia, mostly it was never true for any of them, but for China and Russia, I think a lot of it was them attempting to readjust to a post-Cold War world, in which kind of capitalism then, was dominating. And so previously during the Cold War, they were kind of on the other side, opposite, many of these Western states or Western countries. And so now in a post-Cold War world, they want to benefit from the capitalism that is now the dominant economic system. And so though they were espousing this idea that they were going to do something different, they didn't. And I think China and Russia really kind of benefited from already having a presence in these countries during the Cold War. So, we know that China and Russia often provided aid to many countries that had socialist or communist economic systems, in their bid to get them on their side of the Cold War, in a similar way that the US and Western Europe attempted to get countries that had capitalist economic systems, give them aid to be on their side. So it was just kind of like this divided world. So China and Russia already kind of had this presence already, and already had this history. But with the BRICS, there's no competing economic systems. And it's basically just neoliberalism in color, and in color because the people are coming from countries, Black and brown countries. And so, where neoliberalism, or those espousing it, were primarily just white. Now it's rainbow color, neoliberalism, or neoliberalism in color. So I'm gonna coin that term. And so the policies seem to push the same neoliberal agenda, and only, instead of the colonizers benefiting, or the former colonizers, it's, many of the former colonized, so that whole "the meek shall inherit the earth" thing, and then oppress those who are still meek, is pretty much just that system. And few people on the ground really care. Their lives don't change very much, whether they're in a system dominated by BRICS or by NATO or, by the EU. Their lives don't really change. So there's always been this potential to establish, because these countries are large in terms of populations, their economies, especially China and Russia, or especially China, is huge. So there was always this potential to establish an economic system that challenged capitalism, that challenged neoliberalism. Because one thing that we learned from the Cold War is that there is a lot in between socialism and capitalism. So you don't necessarily have to say, okay, well, we're not necessarily going to practice the socialism we were practicing during the Cold War. So then the only other alternative is to join in this neoliberal capitalist economic system. There's a whole lot that you could do that's in between. And you have the money, you have the population, you have the political power, especially again, Russia and China, to really kind of shake up the entire international system. And they chose not to do that. They pretty much just chose to benefit. And so, like I said, I really didn't know much about the BRICS, and remember them being established and saying, oh, that's interesting. Wonder, what's going to happen there. And then went back to my usual area, which is more cultural studies. And then came back for this And then I was like, yeah, not surprised that nothing good really came of that. And not because I'm pessimistic, but just, honestly, not having a lot of faith that these leaders, especially now with the new president, well, not new, but newer president of Brazil, anything he's involved in surely is not good for the people. He's proven that again and again. So that's my kind of analysis of the BRICS.
Thank you very much. Let's say, so thanks very much, Sia. It was nice. And then, even though you were saying that, you were not an expert, but I learned several things, talking about the rainbow, how is it that rainbow, like colonialism or something like that. Okay, so yes.
Neoliberalism in color.
Neoliberalism in colors. I said, it seems to like something, that's the first time I'm hearing that. And then I think that you can coin it, even though we may not agree with you, and so that you can be quoted. So thanks very much, friend Sia. So Sia is an associate professor in the Department of African Studies at Howard University. So Sia, Adrian, and Jiba, this is the crew of the people who went to Howard. And then, so we've been engaging in that kind of conversation like for, let's say, for 20 good years now. And then we are trying to do what we can, to bring some change in our respective communities. So now we're going to listen to Sean Blackman. Sean Blackman is a great speaker, is the host of by Any Means Necessary at Sputnik Radio. Is also a member of, I don't know if I can say that, but Sean, I'll let you introduce yourself and talk about your topic.
Absolutely. Well, thanks a lot, Iñaki. Yes, my name is Sean Blackman. I am the host of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, also organized with the Answer Coalition. And I'm also not a expert on BRICS as an institution, but I do follow, particularly as part of my work on the show, a number of the countries involved rather closely. And I really wanted to, in terms of my talk today, talk about the dynamics, really the geopolitical dynamics here at play from the standpoint of global social movements, who not only have been organizing around many relevant issues, who, in my opinion, hold the best potential for a real systemic change, as the most powerful governments on earth continue to operate contrary to the interest of humanity. And I want to start with something we saw just this week as US President Joe Biden, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and Australia Prime Minister Scott Morrison jointly announced a new enhanced trilateral so-called security partnership called AUKUS. I believe it's pronounced AUKUS. This agreement will deliver a nuclear-powered submarine fleet to Australia and enable that fleet to patrol the Indo-Pacific region. Now, even though Australia's Morrison said the pact would help protect, quote, the rule of law, the independence of sovereign states, and the peaceful fellowship of nations, and Johnson said he looked forward to the UK working hand in glove to preserve security and stability in the Indo-Pacific. In reality, this move really just signals a serious escalation of the West's new Cold War against China, as Washington enlists a couple of its junior partners to join in the effort to stop the rise of China as America's chief economic rival. And it's no coincidence that Washington makes this pivot not long after pulling out of a 40-year boondoggle in Afghanistan that was as bloody as it was embarrassing. And speaking of China, in terms of some of the broader context, I feel like I should also note that in terms of their most recent developments, I mean, not only has that government ended extreme poverty there, it also has had one of the best responses to the coronavirus pandemic, really of any country, using methods deemed authoritarian by the West. And so all this, along with the successes of things like the Belt and Road Initiative and other signs of growth, really leaves little mystery as to, what could be motivating this saber rattling from Washington. And though those of us in the United States were promised a reprieve from the openly racist and belligerent policies of former President Donald Trump if Joe Biden was elected, what we've seen in many cases is a maintaining of this imperialist foreign policy, and in some cases doubling down. And so this comes as no surprise because, the two ruling class parties in this country, Democrats, Republicans, they're often in lockstep in matters of war and domination. And so the Biden-Harris administration seems just as intent to stoke a hot war with Beijing as was their blustering bellicose predecessor. Meanwhile, in Brazil, which we just spoke about a moment ago, the far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, has been on a march against democracy in his country, recently threatening to storm the Supreme Court, along with his followers, making baseless preemptive claims of electoral fraud in the country's 2022 elections before they even happened, in a move that was clearly inspired by Donald Trump's seditious conspiracy in the US here on January 7th of this year. And all it really amounted to in the end was a mass gathering of his minions for this Trump of the tropics, as they call him, who's really feeling the pressure as his approval ratings drop because of his really criminal mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic and his fear of an electoral defeat at the hands of Lula da Silva, whose popularity really hasn't wavered in Brazil, even as he was made a prisoner over a trumped-up conspiracy. And also in recent months, moving along to the African continent, South Africa has seen out-and-out food riots as hunger and poverty increased there. And in August, there was the assassination of Malumbongwe Madazo, who was an organizer with the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, who had not long before led a 7,000 worker strong demonstration as part of a labor dispute against the mining companies connected to Impala Platinum, the world's second largest producer of platinum. So, of course, a long history of resource exploitation there. And so looking at recent events in some of these different BRICS countries, be they developed or developing, I think what ties them all together is the intensifying impacts of neoliberalism and the ravages of imperialism and colonialism driven by the wealthier countries, namely the United States, which has resulted in the immiseration of people all over the world. And as if all that wasn't enough, these already precarious conditions have been made even worse by the onset of a global pandemic, with the brunt of the impacts, of course, resting mostly on the shoulders of poor working and oppressed people, both inside the US and in developing countries as well. And wealthy countries like Canada have enough vaccines, for instance, to vaccinate their population 5 times over, with other countries hoarding vaccines for boosters, while, for instance, on the African continent, less than 2% of people are fully vaccinated. So this, along with the refusal to lift sanctions, really shows that, not even a pandemic can stop the inhumanity of imperialism. So then what is to be done, right? I think that we would do well to sort of strengthen relationships with the social movements, not just in the BRICS countries, but also all around the globe. And we're seeing this, I think, already in a number of different ways. Just this past summer in the US, there was a rebellion against racism, the Black Lives Matter movement surrounding the racist police killing of George Floyd. And the struggle against Bolsonaro in Brazil is being led by, the MST, the Landless Workers Movement. I mentioned NUMSA in South Africa a moment ago. And there's also, formations like the Socialist Revolutionary Workers Party. Elsewhere in the continent, we have the Socialist Forum of Ghana, people struggling in Eswatini against King Mswati, the last king of Africa. And of course, you have the farmer strikes in India. And so for me, in the final analysis, to wrap up here, a global class struggle, requires a global response and real international solidarity. And just like, the non-aligned movement of its time and other groups that we could talk about today, like, CELAC and UNASUR and ALBA and things like this, our organizations must be clear and principled in their opposition to Western hegemony, great power conflict, and to a system that places war profits and plunder over the interests of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. And so we're going to open the floor, for questions and answers. But before we do so, I wanted to thank you. We wanted to start on time, and then we did. And then we are here having this conversation. And then I'm glad that Dr. Msia Clark and then Sean accepted to be here today with us. Our next conference should be on October 23, the 23rd. Adrian, who is here, will be on the panel. And then we certainly have Maurice Kane, the Director of Friends of the Congo, who is going to share the stage with Adrian Wallace. And the topic will be about the BRICS and regional economic integration. And then it's going to also be a very interesting conversation. And with other friends, we are going to put together a conference on Thomas Sankara. We started doing that since 2012. It is an annual conference. We will do that on October 16. So if you're not in our mailing list, you may put your email here in the group chat, so that we can connect, we can contact you. I will start asking my first question to Dr. Clark. So Sia, so why do you say that there is no, the BRICS countries have not brought any particular change in terms of the economic approach? And you were talking about the rainbow neoliberalism. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, of course. So I think initially there was a lot of hope that, these are countries, especially, countries that had previously experienced, oppression, and especially with Brazil and India, kind of officially being colonies, and of course, South Africa having gone through apartheid, that there would be a greater kind of understanding of the need for, especially, when you look in the past with dependency theories and just kind of looking at how the international system has been established and set up to really benefit, Western Europe, that there would be this understanding that there needed to be something different, that there needed to be economic policies that were not kind of based on the same neoliberal agenda that was already there, this kind of privatization of everything, the valuing of capital and money over human rights and human dignity. And so that was kind of the assumption, and that they were going to establish a bank that was different from the IMF and the World Bank. And perhaps that part, in terms of the conditions under which you can borrow money, may be different. I have not really looked at the conditions under which a country is allowed to borrow money from BRICS. But in terms of the political and economic system that they are promoting, it really doesn't do a whole lot different than the economic systems that were already there being promoted. As far as Russia and China are concerned, I mean, we've seen, like I said, they've had this presence already, but we've seen that especially China really just has very little concern with your human rights. Whatever you want to do in that country, in your own country, is fine. If you have oil, we want your oil. What you do other than give us oil that's your business. And so I think that there is no significant improvement. I mean, you also would think that because both Russia and China were kind of like the leading countries during the Cold War who had established a different type of economic system, that they would not just completely abandon that to, kind of go over to the side of gangster capitalism. but that hasn't been the case. So that's why I kind of say that there hasn't been a change in the life of the people on the ground. Perhaps the people who are benefiting, the people who are getting wealthy are diverse. So they're not all kind of European. But I haven't seen evidence of a huge change or a huge shift in the conditions of the people under BRICS.
Okay, thank you. I see, Sean, do you want to react to that, or I can go to somebody in the audience?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's an interesting question because I mean, I feel like there's a lot of different groupings, sort of similar to BRICS, that we could point to around the world that, you know, that may be, you know, good politically, at least from my perspective, or have that kind of promise. But you know, it's happening within the context of a sort of already very deep imperialist presence across the globe, but that same imperialist structure, if you will, is in decline. It's sort of showing cracks in its foundation. Now, I don't think it'll crumble tomorrow or anything like that, but I think something that we saw, particularly under Trump, was a kind of strengthening of certain relationships between countries and a real sort of move towards trying to come up with some kind of alternative to having to deal with the economic supremacy, if you will, of the United States. Because, I mean, Donald Trump was it was so, you know, like unpredictable and belligerent in the way that he operated. And, you know, there can't be economic growth and development, things like that, when you have that kind of unpredictability. So, I mean, out of a desire to, I mean, simply preserve, you know, the integrity of any number of things happening within the I think we started to see a deepening of some of these relationships. And so I think it'll take quite a bit, you know, to actually give them some oomph, if you will. But, you know, as long as there's the supremacy of the dollar and all these sorts of things and the ongoing stranglehold that we're seeing in a number of ways, that I think it'll continue likely to be difficult to really make some of these things manifest. But I mean, from my perspective, the chief contradiction in all of this is the capitalist system itself, which is the material basis for imperialism. And if that contradiction is resolved and overturned, then I see a sort of significant shift in a lot of these dynamics.
About Sean, as you know, you were talking about Donald Trump. Dr. Kwame Safro, an associate professor here at Lincoln University, I ask you a question. Sean, do you think Biden is as bad as Trump? Do you?
Well, from my perspective, when you look at the Democrats and Republicans, you're looking at two sides of the same coin. These are two parties who both represent different wings of the U.S. ruling class, of the U.S. capitalist interests. And they often take different routes to the same destination. Let's take the example of climate change, right? Something that we're living in right in this moment and are seeing with our own eyes. So the Republicans, for their part, just completely deny it, completely reject the science of it and all of that. It's not real, it's not happening. Okay. Now, on the flip side of that, we have the Democrats who will acknowledge that there's an issue, but who won't, you know, make any real strides against, say, you know, moving away from fossil fuels or changing, you know, corporate food systems. And the reason being is that on both sides, they're both tied into these very same corporate interests that's driving a lot of these same issues, right? And I mean, let's look at, for another example, for Trump and Biden specifically, on, say, you know, the coronavirus pandemic and this Wuhan lab leak conspiracy. And so Donald Trump was the first to sort of push this. I mean, obviously, racist sort of notion about this, which is, I mean, it's a racist conspiracy is what it is. And so now we have Joe Biden sort of doing the same thing, just not in a less overtly racist way. I mean, Biden is more sort of polite in his presentation, but the substance of it is the same. And while we're talking about Biden, I mean, if we look at his cabinet, he has one of the most diverse cabinets we've seen in an American president. I mean, he's got Black folks, he's got Latin folks, he's got transgender people, Native Americans. They're diverse in terms of their identity, but there's a oneness of ideology, right? And so they're every bit as much as a part of this imperialist march as any white cabinet would be, so it's just, just like the sister talked about, rainbow neoliberalism. Well, here we have intersectional imperialism, you feel me? And so this is sort of what we're dealing with. And so they may not operate precisely the same way or say precisely the same things. Ultimately, Democrats, Republicans, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, they have the same class interests. And this is why I think we see them operate the way they do from my perspective.
Okay. So thank you so much. When I see our people so brilliant, I'm learning there are so many new concepts this morning. So thank you so much, Sean. And so now I saw two friends who raised their hands. Dr. Msia Freyot, go first.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for the brilliant presentation. Sorry, I'm not on camera. My camera's sideways. Anyhow, so I guess I have a comment / question. And I wanted to bring this BRICS conversation back to the continent. And I want to sort of tackle something that Dr. Kibona Clark said around neoliberalism sort of in color. And I see what you see on the ground is you see people of African descent, people that look like you and me, who theoretically should have the best interests of Africans in their heart and in their minds, and even in the work that they do, really ascribing to Western petty bourgeois ideology. And I think that this is drastically impacting the African continent and our ability to move forward towards Pan-Africanism. And I think that this goes back to this notion of a BRICS or any external entity that we need, so quote unquote need, in order to borrow money or for development or any of these issues. Is there not, I mean, we know there is, but is there not a internal body? And we know the AU is toothless, by the way, so we know it's not the AU. But is there not, or should we be not pushing for an internal economic body which could serve the same purposes as some of these international finance corporations? And I think that what I would suggest we do, this is my last point, but I think that we need to turn the microscope into the resources that we have available on the continent in order to begin to push intercontinental trade and abandon borrowing from international monetary institutions, no matter who they happen to be. And then the last thing I want to just ask is, how do we rectify these petty bourgeois, anti-African Africans who happen to be in the leadership of many institutions across the continent? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Msia. Msia, that's the one I was talking about in the introduction. We entered the PhD program together in 2002. She's one of my best friends, and then she's one of my vision partners, and then she has been doing great things in the field of scholarship and also in the field of social activism. And then she was the one who organized the 60th anniversary of the All African People's Conference that Kwame Nkrumah organized and George Padboy in 1958. So, Sia, can you answer the question of your friend?
Yeah, I mean, I think that she's right in terms of looking at, kind of the elites on the continent and in the diaspora. I know that a lot of attention, for example, was given to the whole, year of return 2019, and Ghana has been, for a very long time, really the country, the primary destination for the many of those in the diaspora. But unfortunately, many of those in the diaspora who are returning to the continent are doing so with dollar signs in their eyes. And they're looking at, well, how can I get a piece of that? How can I leverage my Western passport to continue the exploitation, or to kind of mimic the exploitation that kind of was happening prior to my arrival, but it was being done largely by, Europeans and so forth. And so then you have, those who were educated, born and raised on the continent, who pretty much are doing the same thing. And so I think that if you don't have the people's interest at heart, then there's going to always be a problem, because if you don't have the people's interest at heart, then, we can assume that your main interests lie within yourself and your bank account. And so I think the idea that just because these people look like us does not necessarily, what is it? All skin folk ain't kinfolk. So I think that's a problem that we sometimes have, is we see people, oh, they look, like us, I'm rooting for everybody Black. And then our conditions don't change. And that's because those individuals, and I've always said that there's a big difference between fighting to transform a system, fighting to kind of completely revolutionize the system, and then fighting to get access to that system. And I think that within our communities, whether you're talking about the civil rights movement, Black nationalist movement, independence movements, there has always been two camps. There's always been those who were fighting to get access to that system. And many of those moved into the neighborhoods that were occupied by the former colonizers. Like I know in Tanzania, Oyster Bay was pretty much, that's where the Europeans lived, the British lived. Now it's a bunch of Africans living there. But they haven't done anything necessarily better than the Europeans. And so I think that's kind of an issue. And then you have those others of us who are in the minority who have fought to completely change the system, because we realize the system is crooked, the system does not benefit us, and that if we enter that system, we will leave behind the majority of our people. And so I think that, we need to, confront and challenge and hold those who are in power accountable for what we need.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sia. So, Sean, do you want to react to that question, or I can ask another person in the audience to ask another question?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I feel like what Dr. Frey-Watt is raising, at least to an extent, is a question of class consciousness, right? And I think what Dr. Clark raised is absolutely right. I think definitely I've sort of noticed that in terms of Black Americans returning to the continent with this, thing of, wanting to buy land and do all that sort of thing. And, what gives me hope about the whole situation is when we look at who's really the driving force behind a lot of the social movements on the continent, who are really raising a lot of these issues in a critical way, is young people, because Africa is a pretty young continent in terms of age. And so we have a whole generation of people who are already sort of dedicating themselves to a lifetime of struggle against these sort of basically neo-colonial sorts of structures. I mean, I mentioned earlier about the struggle in, Eswatini against King Mswati, right? And I think we see this in a number of ways, definitely in the Congo, all over the continent. I think that we see that. So to me, I think that really the motive force for change within that sense are going to be the young people of Africa. And I think that both those of us in diaspora and the conscious people of this earth would do well to keep an eye on what they're doing and finding out best ways to support them. And to the question about, you know, basically alternative economic structure. I mean, sure, I think those sorts of institutions should be built and supported. But I feel like institutions like that sort of can face the same challenges of a BRICS or an ALBA or any of these other sorts of bodies, particularly when you talk about the relationship of forces, because, I mean, if I remember correctly, I mean, you know, Muammar Gaddafi was trying to, move away from a European economic standard. And, you know, not only was he, you know, ousted and lynched in the streets, I mean, Libya was plunged into a failed state with open air slave markets. And so, you know, here again, we see, imperialism asserting itself to stop any sort of a real self-determination, certainly in Africa of all places, which is always sort of crucially important. So all of these things taken together, I think will mean that we'll have to develop ourselves and strengthen our relationships with folks on the continent in terms of really pushing for these institutions to have that kind of, you know, real dynamic change.
Thank you very much, Sean.
So the discussion I'll say will be a little bit more philosophical. When I actually look at the situation, it seems to me that what we are trying to deal with is really ingrained into one thinking, and that is really based on finite resources and capital. So whether we have an alternative, let's say, group coming on the scene, operating within the same paradigm, I don't see how things are going to change, because they're not setting the rules, they're just abiding by the rules. So the question I want to ask is, could we consider maybe thinking through and propose a different paradigm that will really truly empower nations and cultures and countries, so that an alternative is proposed? Because when I actually look at the situation, I'm not sure that I understand how the BRICS are going to do anything different to what is actually going on. So I would like to have the thought of the panelists as well as other people. Thank you.
Dr. Sia Clark?
Well, you know, I definitely, you know, essentially agree that the BRICS is not going to be, you know, we see that they're not having there's not any fundamental change. Again, I think that when you're looking at these policies, it comes down to, do the people on the ground feel any improvement in their conditions? If the answer is no, why not? And if the answer is, you know, perhaps, you know, sometimes I think in the past it's been, oh, well, the country is not embracing this neoliberal policy with enough fervor, but we know that the issue is in the policy itself, the whole kind of structure of it, its intention. And so you weren't going to be able to get any other result with those policies. And so again, when you're looking at the BRICS, is the condition of the people on the ground changing? And if it's not, then whatever you're doing is probably problematic. And we know, again, you know, with what we see in the policies that the BRICS is kind of promoting, that there's just no way for the conditions to change significantly with following that same formula that we know doesn't work. Even if you change the name, structural adjustment programs, so was it poverty reduction strategy papers or something? Like, you change the name of it, but it's still the same. So BRICS, NATO, whatever you want to call it, it's still, you know, I don't mean to sound very cynical, but I guess it's being frustrated, because if it was progressive, if they were establishing a system that was going to really challenge what was happening, you would see a whole lot more being done by European countries and American countries to sabotage it. Not to say that they're not, because they're also kind of maybe dipping into their pockets. And so maybe there's a resistance on that end. But if the goal of BRICS was to really empower the people and bring about a systematic change, you would see a whole lot more resistance on behalf of Europe and the United States. And we don't see that, because that kind of threat is not happening.
Okay. Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, I was thinking about, because the brother asked about, you know, changing the structure, and you think about how the US government will say this or that country is going against the quote rules-based order, of course, heavily implying that they are in fact the ones that make the rules. And, you know, the international situation, I think both within the BRICS countries and outside of it, is all happening within, you know, the reality of a global capitalist system, right? And an American empire with its 800 some odd military bases that we know of. And we've been talking a lot about the continent today, and rightfully so. You know, we know the Africa Command, and a lot of what they do is clandestine. We really don't even know. You know, it's not until an American troop gets killed in Niger or something that we even know that the U.S. military is in AFRICOM. And we know historically about what's been done in Rwanda and in places like this. And I mean, you know, we just saw the coup in Guinea, right? And we see that some of the coup leaders have, you know, training through some of these same structures. And so we're talking about a system that has its, you know, its fangs and its claws sort of sunk deep into the whole of the earth, the people's lands and resources of the whole of the earth, right? But because of that, because of capitalism's infinite hunger for a planet with finite resources, it's sort of begun to set the stage for its own decline, which I think is happening little by little, and is why I think we see the U.S. on the defensive so much in its posture towards China or Russia specifically. I think those two in a number of ways. And, you know, I think it tends to, and by it, I mean the United States tends to, you know, be afraid of some of these sort of countries in and of themselves, even if not some of these international groupings, be it BRICS or the other. I think ultimately, though, it's objectively a good thing, you know, for different countries to be trying to work towards some kind of alternative, making whatever small inroads they may be able to make. But I also think, like with anything, you know, the pressure and what pushes these countries and these groupings in a particular direction, it has to be a part of an organized effort. And so my real answer to that question, if I could sum it up in a word, and not to sound cliche, is to organize. You know what I mean? Because the only reason that Nkrumah, Lumumba, Sankara, all of these people were able to be successful and come to power was through, you know, organizing at the most basic level and carrying it through and ultimately, you know, becoming victorious. So, I mean, that's why even the whole neo-colonial process that we see on the continent is so pervasive. It was actually necessary as a response to those sorts of politics and to those sorts of movements. And so, you know, ultimately, I just feel like, you know, as long as imperialism itself is sort of the dominant frame, and it itself being the highest expression of capitalism, in my opinion, sort of reifies capitalism as sort of a core contradiction.
Thank you. So Adrian, so I see I was going to come to you, Adrian. So I saw your hand. So I don't know if you want to ask a question, but I wanted to react to the question, if you don't mind, if you want, you know, not that you are going to give a preview of your presentation, but do you think that you can answer, or you just want to ask your question?
Well, yeah, I can make a comment, and then it's probably connected to my question. And I guess my comment would be, with the BRICS organization, I think it's really helpful to also look at the bilateral relationships that the members of BRICS have with other countries on the continent, because that's quite telling. And so even when we think about the ways that, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are cooperating with each other, it's still just kind of focused on each country's national strategic interests, as opposed to any kind of collective movement to either challenge neoliberalism or to challenge Western imperialism. It's still, like many other people have said today, kind of the same ideological approach. And so part of the dangers, I think, of an institution like BRICS, if we're not critical and careful, is that they can mask, looking progressive with deepening these kind of economic relationships that are exploitative, right? And especially when we think about China. And other countries as well. But China is very transparent about their interest in extracting resources from various African countries, and they're willing to negotiate as much as that particular state government is willing to negotiate. And so that goes back to the issues that people were raising about folks on the ground being very kind of disjointed from the overall goals of sustainable economic and inclusive growth, right? Because it's not about creating a model or redistributing wealth or thinking about protecting labor in ways that are substantive. It's really about, countries looking at their GDPs or their GNPs at an aggregate level. And that's, kind of it, which makes people more vulnerable. So I guess I think that one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, we know what the limitations of the current configuration of BRICS looks like, but what would a BRICS-like organization do under ideal conditions to really promote regional economic integration in Africa, at an aggregate level that would also improve the lives of everyone on the grassroots level as well? What would that new model actually look like? And then at what point would organizations like the BRICS stop dealing with countries just individually and start thinking about engaging with institutions more collectively on the ground? Because the longer there are divisions, especially on the continent, with individual countries kind of having to bargain on their own, then that's just going to continue those same structures of exploitation, the same global value chain system, where it's just resource extraction and there's no material shift in modes of production or protection of labor, right? And so I think that's something that we would have to, we would certainly have to consider. So I guess my question would just be, what kind of dynamic would we want to see BRICS implement in thinking about economic development and growth and engaging with African countries collectively that would reverse some of the same approaches that we continue to see, every day with our usual models? So I guess that would be my question. So what would we want to see if we could articulate our vision of what the BRICS could do? What would we want to see materialize on the ground? And then once we kind of think collectively, I think about articulating that vision, then it provides a path to think pragmatically about how we could actually implement it. So I'll just kind of stop there.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. Sia?
Mm-hmm. No, I love the question, because I think that, looking at, again, post-Cold War, world, there aren't too many approaches or ideologies that are there challenging neoliberalism, or at least at that level. So there's a lot of challenge to it, but at that level, in terms of international governments and things like that, there hasn't been much of a challenge. And so I think that in looking at the approach or the ideology that, would be infinitely better, I think one that centers the people, one that centers, for example, when we look at the relationship between the West, or between, I don't know, now looking at the geopolitics of things, the North versus the global South, West versus, it's kind of all, doesn't really apply anymore because of these shifts. So that's one thing BRICS did. It created a shift in how we look at the world, North versus South. So I think that the way things are now, natural resources are extracted from Africa, manufactured elsewhere, and kind of sold back to Africans at infinitely higher prices. So I think a system, an economic system that promoted development on the continent, again, thinking about the continent, because that's the region I know the best, is focusing on manufacturing there, and making sure that the people in those countries benefit from the fact that all of these resources, like coltan coming from the Congo, there's no reason why the people in the Congo should not be living a whole lot better than they do, since all of us need their minerals. So when you're looking at, these industries and looking at what's being manufactured and who's benefiting from them, so I think an approach that promoted manufacturing, but then also encourage not just this kind of trade relationship in which the West or which BRICS or whoever controls the conditions of those trade. That trade, I think, needs to shift. So, you know, I've always kind of said it in going to Ghana, for example, like, wow, you guys could really benefit from some East African tea because the tea they have in Ghana is just not very good. East Africans could benefit from having, you know, cocoa from West Africa. We don't need BRICS and everybody else to do that. But there are blocks in doing that because other people are not getting paid from that. So they don't necessarily want that to happen. If you don't go through what is the international trade, whatever market, there's prices that are dominated by Europeans, it makes it very difficult. So getting rid of that, making it easier for us to communicate with each other. And look, you've got these resources, we've got these, let's kind of work together and not worry about what's happening in Europe. We don't need to worry about what they're doing. They don't really have the natural resources that we do. And so I think that these countries like Brazil, like South Africa, like India, are in a similar condition. They have lots of natural resources. And so we can work together without this kind of need to dominate or oppress or marginalize the masses. So that's what I would say, coming up with a system that kind of promotes manufacturing in those countries and that encourages those countries to kind of trade with each other and work together more cooperatively, because by default, those governments would also benefit from having these stronger economies. So it's not like they're not going to get their little share or whatever. They're not going to become poor in this kind of restructured economic system.
Thank you, Sia. Sean?
Yeah, and I actually want to connect this question to one I see in the chat by Makubi. It says, what alternative ideology can we offer to create a paradigm shift? And I mean, in terms of what the institution would look like, I mean, in the broadest sense, and Dr. Clark was getting at this, it would have to be the flip reverse of what we have currently, right? Because under a global capitalist system, we have a small number of people who hoard the wealth extracted from places like the African continent, who hoard the wealth that we create with our labor and things like that, and they keep it, and we subsist on whatever little bit that they throw us in. And in places like Africa, on the African continent and other parts of the developing world, that's very, very, very little, almost too little to, well, not even almost, it is too little to live on, you know what I mean? And so there would have to be a situation where the wealth that is produced, instead of going up to some small group of people, is then actually distributed and put first and foremost towards people's interest and infrastructure and all the things that human beings need, right? And so, you know, that's why, you know, I would say that, again, capitalism itself can no longer be the dominant mode of production to come about. And in terms of the alternative ideologies, I actually think that there's a lot of, what could we call it? Indigenous wisdom about how to handle some of these things, right? And so what I mean is, with these different cultures and these different groups, I mean, they have ways of handling certain things that, you know, go back to almost time immemorial. And I actually think that there's a way for those sorts of things to be sort of integrated. You have these longstanding cultural practices that can be directly connected to the way policies are carried forward, so that it becomes like, you know, a more natural aspect of people's life, and it can become more of a driving dynamic of what improves people's conditions. Now, you know, in the US, we're told that basically this Western Euro-American way of operating, basically this liberal style of democracy, is, you know, the best, greatest system. It's the most democratic, the one that's most, you know, advantageous towards human rights or whatever. But I mean, the way we see that operating on a global scale, and certainly on the African continent as well, is obviously the complete opposite. So I actually think that, you know, we should lean in to the way folks have been operating in a lot of ways that I think could be a real boon to how the social, political, and economic aspect of it operates as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to come back a bit to the question or to one of the comment Dr. Njiba raised. It is concerning IMF and institutions like World Bank. It is true that we don't want to be naive, but with the BRICS, we also think that they have a project to have kind of financial institutions that can also try to help in the development of all the strategy, and that will not be based on neoliberalism program, because one of the things today for our continent and in the relationship with the US and all the Western forces is the fact that a lot of the politics in terms of economic, it is based on that neoliberal system, and that is what is also undermine our development as a continent, as a underdeveloped country, if I can use this term but put it in bracket. So we also have to understand that part and try to see. It is not that we think that all our problem will be solved with BRICS, but we think that it will be a new will be a new paradigm for our development. We don't think that it cannot be like maybe with the other forces, but with the bases, and that is also why as a continent we have to be united, because we cannot go individually and have a good relation or trade relation with some of the country. That is just my comment, and I think that we have to put that in mind. Maybe the last thing I would like also maybe to recommend is how maybe with Dr. Nyaka we can see maybe to go in the fundamentally in the roots of BRICS to also help people to understand the beginning of that structure and why we think that it can be an opportunity of development in our struggle to Pan-Africanists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I will Ora, just give me 1 second. Dr. Fu put comments in the group chat. Many thanks to our speakers. I agree with many of the points that they made, and I appreciate the conversation around a potential paradigm shift for global change. Yes, so yes, but the Safro is making me laugh here. So he said that he's impressed with my precision with time. Yes, Dr. Safro, this is what I learned, and we will talk about that, when we meet. So Ora, do you want Ora? Do you have any question or comment? And then, like I said, these conversations on Zoom, that's not the time to have 2 hours conversation on Zoom on Saturday. 1 hour, 15 minutes, 1:30, but I don't even want us to reach 1 hour, 15 minutes. So after Ora, if there is no other comments, I will ask the speakers to give their final points, and then we're going to close this conversation.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nyaka, and to the presenters. Just thinking out loud to myself, would a United States or Federation of Africa, and I'm not saying that would be an easy undertaking, it's probably very complicated and a lot of things to work out, be more of a solution and a way forward to really combat the Western hegemony? Because I feel like if we don't really deal with that, they have all these various strengths and powers. And when we try to take them on individually, whatever we be on a continent or an island, I can't see us really getting out from under that, just because of all the tools and the weaponry and of their ways of living and doing and being are very, very strong. So just my thought in this, and everybody can weigh in on that. Thank you, Dr. Nyaka.
Anytime. So before ask the presenters to answer Ora's question, I see that I think Stephanie, she asked what positive outcomes, if any, have occurred due to the creation of the BRICS. And then the Ora's question, if the existence or the creation of the United States of Africa will be the answer. So these are the two questions, the answer, and then we're going to, close this conversation.
I mean, honestly, I can just say briefly, I'm from the Kwame Ture thought in that, I believe that an ultimate goal would be in Africa united under scientific socialism. And so I think that would be primary in any sort of effort like that. So the short answer is yes. I do think that kind of continental unity is actually imperative. But, as you noted in your question, a goodly number of contradictions to reconcile when we get to that point, to say the very least.
Okay, thank you. So what about the outcomes, if any, of the BRICS?
Oh, that's hard to say, honestly, because I've really only started looking into BRICS when Nyaka asked me to put this panel.
Well,
so
you guys did well, both of you, even if it was short notice, great conversation. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, honestly, I'm not best positioned to really answer that, just to be honest. So I'm not sure.
Okay, no problem. So we have one last question, but so Sia?
I'm also not really, I don't know about the benefits of BRICS or if they've done anything good. I'm not sure. Most of the stuff I found and kind of preparing, none of it really mentioned anything, but perhaps the next panel, I know Dr. Wallace, it's kind of more her area of expertise, so she may have some information at the next talk. As soon as she started asking about the United States of Africa, I was like, oh, okay. So I think that is a significant, there are areas in which those of us who are really working towards the, improvement of the conditions under which our people live, and that is our primary goal, our primary focus. There are ideological shifts and divisions, I would say, amongst that. So, you've got the folks that are just straight up capitalists. They just want to take what they can, survival of the fittest. And I think that those of us who are putting the people first or centering the people, even amongst us, there are kind of ideological differences, I should say. So I'm not in the camp that we necessarily need one political unit in Africa, that we need the United States of Africa with one central government. I don't feel that we need that in order for Africa to be more united in their policies and the way that they deal with Europe. That Nigeria, so when you look at the major countries with the biggest economies, Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, for example, if the three of them or the other countries that kind of have bigger economies were to set the tone and say, we're not doing this anymore with you, World Bank or IMF, it would give countries that, one, have smaller economies the support and power and strength to stand up and say the same thing. If African Union was kind of a functional organization that was really, again, centering the people, you wouldn't need to have one political government if the AU was doing the job it was supposed to do. Because we would still all act in an accord in which, because you don't see the EU, which still has its separate independent, countries, acting in ways that would be of a detriment to other member countries. They act in unison, so they don't necessarily divide themselves as much. We had the whole Brexit mess, whatever. But as far as Africans, if we were on the same page and we were working for the betterment of our people, it wouldn't be necessary that we would have a political union. But I'm not. So that's my position on it. Though I know others do believe that we do need to have that. So that's just kind of, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yes, we have one last question. I promise it's going to be the last one. I know, some of our friends wanted to, when they asked a question about a paradigm shift, what will be like the better, not a better, but an ideology, an alternative ideology. And then as people saw that I was not jumping into the conversation to talk about Ubuntu, they send me some private messages about talk about Ubuntu. But I'm just a moderator today. So I'm not a speaker, so I'm not a panelist. So I'm not going to, talk about Ubuntu today. And I admire my two friends who are giving like a wonderful conversation, and then all the people who are reacting. I appreciate that. So the very last question, and this is the group chat. I ask the question and then we close. I will start this time with Msia. And then, so the question is, let me see. Where did I put it? So I want to say it exactly the way it is here. Okay, is that's you put USSR a lesson at all for Africa? So this is the question. I don't know if the friend or the brother who wrote who asked the question if he's talking about Russia today, but I think I saw USSR. So it means that is what in the Cold War, in the context of the Cold War. So, Msia, so is the USSR a lesson at all for Africa?
I think that there's a lot of danger there in a sense, because we've seen Russia kind of try to post Cold War reassert its dominance over the countries that were in the USSR, and in a way that is very imperialist, and so I think that scares me. That idea in terms of power and where that power would be centralized. And so I think that we've seen post-Cold War kind of what that has happened. And one of the ways in which that, not only was Russia kind of maintaining its grip on power, but also the United States, in an effort not to lose any territory or to, lose any points, were kind of implementing some policies or approaches that were a little strong-handed, strong-armed, and I think that scares me when the idea of there being this central power that has that much power and control, and that if you try to move away from that like the consequences, could be you're invaded and forced to come back into the fold. That scares me, whether it's the US or Russia. And I know that a lot of our countries in Africa were really trying to be part of that non-aligned movement, because we recognized that Russia was not necessarily, African centered. And so there was an attempt to really, but unfortunately, Russia and the United States didn't give people that option. If you accepted money from Russia, you were put in the socialist camp. If you accepted money and aid from the US, you were put in the camp. So it was like you were almost forced to choose, even though leaders said, look, we're not in this battle. We are doing what's best for our people. It didn't matter. So that scares me when I look at the ways in which Russia and the things that they did to maintain their grip on power. That makes me nervous.
Thank you very much, Msia. Sean?
Yeah, well, we don't have the time or space for like a deeper conversation about the Soviet Union, but I personally see the Soviet Union as, really a pretty grand achievement in human history, and one that was ruthlessly attacked by U.S. imperialism and ultimately betrayed from within. And so, in terms of the lessons, one of the main lessons I would say is that, any sort of real effort, any real unified effort that's seen as a threat is going to face that same sort of attack from these same powers, right? And that's what we can expect whenever there's any sort of movement of consequence, be it on the African continent or elsewhere. And, so that being the case, I just think it's always sort of worthwhile to bear in mind, the real relationship of forces and why things sort of play out the way that they do. But this, I think, is just in due course of trying to build that sort of broader movement to really overturn all of these sorts of systems that we've been discussing this afternoon.
Okay, thank you so much, Sean, and then Dr. Clark. I see Ora puts one last comment here. I'm not asking you to answer or to react to that question. I'm going to use that to introduce our next presentation, our next conference. I know there's a conversation about the United States of Africa, one African government, that Dr. Msia forgot. There are many types of United Africa, many regional unity blocks, maybe regional unity blocks, that's Ora, may be more appropriate since there are differences among the Francophone countries and the Anglophone countries. So having read that, I just wanted to tell you that on October the 33rd, we're going to have our next conversation on the BRICS. And then Adrian, who is here, will be talking about the relationship between the BRICS and the new African regional economic framework that was put together like 2018, I don't know, 2018, or maybe 2 years ago. And then that's going to be the conversation. So come prepared. Let's have this conversation, and this is what we want to do. And then we want to take this to the next level. And this is what we're doing. We want to build a stronger alliance, or a universal alliance of those who want to see change in the world, Africans, people of African descent, and then non-Africans, and then our friends in Russia, friends in China. Yes, here you're smiling. We have friends in everywhere we can who believe that we need to have this conversation. This is what we're doing in the name of like a humanness, and in the name of like a symphony of brotherhood. So thank you so much. And then I appreciate you all for coming. Next October 23rd, please be here all the way from South Africa, Belgium, England, Ivory Coast, Chad, Russia. People are here, so we appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I'll let you run. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you.